All right, guys. Nice to see you again. This is Coach Barryline. We're going to do your first installment of the unit over the changes America undergo in the post-war and Cold War period. We'll be talking about the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies specifically, and we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement, the Great Society, the New Frontier, and also the women's rights, Latino rights, and Native American movement. We're going to start out today talking about Kennedy specifically. We're going to talk about his presidency and how he handles the Cold War challenges and other domestic challenges. So first we're going to talk about his Cold War actions as president. And we're going to talk about how his election kind of signals change, what the Bay of Pigs was and why it happened and how it happened. We're talking about the Berlin crisis, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and, of course, Kennedy's foreign policy reflecting his own views of the world. All right, so John F. Kennedy was from a wealthy family, a Massachusetts family. His father had actually made most of his money bootlegging during Prohibition. But anyways, good-looking, young, comfortable in front of television cameras, really charismatic, and much different from a lot of the politicians of that time. So a lot of people saw him as kind of this more modern, hopeful representative of the future. So in the election of 1960, he's going against Richard Nixon, and basically Kennedy coins the term New Frontier, and this played on the nation's Cold War fears. Basically claimed that the nation's prosperity was not spreading equally or well throughout society. He also got the African American vote because he seemed more sympathetic towards the Civil Rights Movement. For instance, he called Coretta Scott King after Martin Luther King had been arrested to basically, show his support, and Robert Kennedy actually was able to persuade his brother Robert Kennedy was able to persuade the judge to let him go. Now 1960 turns out to be one of the closest elections in history, and really it turns on the television debate between he and Richard Nixon. So when he makes his inaugural address, he focuses on change. He talks about the torch being passed from one generation to another. Very strong anti-communist tone. And even though he didn't specify his domestic policy, because there was a lot of division, the Civil Rights Movement was getting into swing, but he sets his administration by trying to gather the best and the brightest people he could around. Many of them were young, Ivy League educated, and his closest advisor, of course, was his brother, who was the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. And actually, his cabinet members had less influence in his White House than did his own personal advisors. All right, so the first real test of his leadership was the Bay of Pigs invasion. And basically what had happened is Fidel Castro had come to power in Cuba, and he wanted to restore people's rights and freedoms from the dictatorship of Batista. So basically, once in power, he nationalizes these private businesses and starts to kind of court the Soviet Union. So when Kennedy became president, he learned that this operation was already under planning. The CIA was training troops to invade Cuba and try to overthrow Castro. And Kennedy goes ahead and says, "Yeah, let's go ahead and do it." Unfortunately, the invasion failed miserably. Information was leaked early, so the Cubans already knew what was coming. Airstrikes never materialized. The United States didn't provide the air cover they had promised. Castro was prepared, and this uprising that they thought would happen once the invasion started, they thought the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow Castro, and it doesn't. And all it does is make the relationship between Castro and the Soviet Union even stronger. So it's a failure from a military standpoint, and it's a failure from a diplomatic standpoint. The next crisis is the Berlin crisis. So you see this Cold War rising up and testing Kennedy early on. And so what happened was that Khrushchev, who was the leader of Communist Soviet Union, basically demanded that the United States recognize East Germany as an independent communist nation. And basically, West Berlin was kind of on its own. It was deep within East Germany. So many East Germans, or many people who lived in East Germany, would kind of use Berlin as a way to get out. And Kennedy says, no, we're not going to have you bullying West Berlin. So he sends troops to West Germany and kind of waits for Khrushchev's next move. So Khrushchev says, look, we're not going to keep losing people to West Berlin. So he builds basically the Berlin Wall. And it's a high concrete wall to prevent people from escaping from East to West Germany. So Kennedy sends more troops. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president at the time, visits. And Kennedy basically kind of just stands pat. And he lets the wall be built. And he says basically a wall is better than a war. So over time, you're going to see the Soviet Union extend the wall and improve it and make it harder to get through. All right. Probably the biggest test of Kennedy's leadership from the Cold War standpoint was after the Bay of Pigs and Berlin. You had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and basically the Soviets and the Cubans were worried about the United States invading, so they began putting missiles on Cuba. The Soviet Union did, and there was a spy plane going by, and it detected these Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba. So the Soviets said, no, these are just defensive. They're not gonna be offensive. But later flights showed that that was a lie. So basically, it comes down to a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. So Kennedy gets his advisors together, and they're talking about an airstrike and a land invasion of Cuba. But that's risky and dangerous. It could lead to war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy goes with another plan of a naval blockade, and basically we send naval ships down there to wait and block any more shipments of missiles from the Soviet Union. So basically, it's tense because the Soviet Union continue their shipments. So it's possible that, there's going to be a naval battle that leads to World War III. And in fact, at one point, American ships do fire over the bow of a Russian vessel that's trying to make a delivery to Cuba. Fortunately, it doesn't wind up in war, and Khrushchev kind of backs down. And so basically, they both agree to certain things that make them look good in their own countries. Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States says, okay, we're not going to invade Cuba, and we'll remove our missiles in Turkey. So they both can claim victories, right? Soviets remove their missiles, the U.S. removes their missiles, and promises the safety of Cuba. But this close call kind of turns out to be a good thing because it convinces Khrushchev and Kennedy to start opening up a dialogue and talking and trying to reduce these tensions. So, this kind of really reflects Kennedy's ideas about the world. He believes in peace, and he doesn't really want to have to build a massive army to be able to keep that peace. He thought that you could be strong, but not have to be so overwhelmingly powerful. And part of this idea was the Peace Corps. And the United States government created this corps to train and send volunteers to Africa, Asia, Latin America, third world countries primarily, to basically increase goodwill toward the United States. Most were young volunteers, recent college graduates, people like that. Also, it created the Alliance for Progress, which helped Latin American countries build infrastructure for building economies and low-cost housing. And basically, this was kind of like a Latin American version of the Marshall Plan, where it's like, if we can help Latin American countries build their economy, then maybe they'll be less likely to support communism. Now, Kennedy is still engaged in containment, but he kind of changes it to include other things besides nuclear weapons. All right, and that's called flexible response. All right, Kennedy makes some really important decisions in the domestic front too. We're going to talk about kind of the energy initiative, these new ideas that he brings to the presidency. You know, people often look upon Kennedy's presidency as this golden age, even though he really was assassinated before he got a lot accomplished. His ideas really energized the United States. We're going to talk about the new frontier, the Warren Court, the new liberal court that's going to make all kinds of important civil rights decisions, and the impact that Kennedy's assassination has on the nation and the world to a lesser degree. All right, so Americans kind of fell in love with the youth of and vitality of the Kennedy White House. You know, he had a beautiful wife, Jackie, and he had young children, and there's all these pictures about, you know, pictures with the kids playing in the Oval Office and things like that really kind of have people fall in love with them. So but despite his popularity, you know, he didn't really have a clear mandate with Congress. It was such a narrow victory. So, you know, he has to get his victories where he can. And the new frontier, this idea of a new America, really is symbolized by space exploration. So again, you know, Kennedy is shown as a young, vital president, even though he was actually very sick and had a debilitatingly bad back. You know, it would make him bedridden at long stretches of time. But anyway, you know, he encouraged the press to photograph and write about his children. Even though Jackie was not crazy about it, she tried to protect them. Whenever she was gone, he would get the kids in the office and have people take pictures of them playing. But anyway, in 1960, you know, he had a hard road to hoe in Congress. Most Congress members were not reform-minded at that time, and he really couldn't make a lot of the changes that he wanted to. So a lot of New Frontier was never enacted. However, sometimes he wasn't able to bypass that. One way that he was able to kind of push the country forward was in the space race. After the launch of Sputnik in the 1950s, Americans had really worried that they were losing the race for space. So this is where the United States does really gain some ground during the Kennedy administration. Also, during the Kennedy administration, the Supreme Court takes a much more active role in shaping public policy. And this is under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice in 1954 for the Brown versus Board of Education. But the Supreme Court really becomes active in enforcing ruling on expanding voting rights, expanding the rights of the accused, people accused of crimes, and also the idea of religious freedom. Earl Warren is going to be one of the most important justices of the 20th century. And before he became a justice, he really didn't have a positive civil rights record. You know, he allowed the internment of Japanese after World War II, for instance. But as Chief Justice, the court becomes much more active, especially in the area of civil rights. Brown versus Board of Education, which I already talked about. You also have the one person, one vote rule that passes during this time in Reynolds versus Sims, and which basically made legislatures redraw districts that matched population-wise. Also, you had things like Miranda versus Arizona, which extended the Bill of Rights to the state government. Said you have to, you know, basically inform people of their rights. Also, religious freedom, you know, Engel versus Vitale, basically, it defined religion guarantees. It defined religious freedom as also freedom from religious. So that's really important as well. And of course, the assassination has a massive impact on American society. President Johnson is sworn in within hours, and Oswald is arrested, and immediately there are suspicions that there's a conspiracy. The Warren Commission is commissioned, and they find that Oswald actually did it. So this touches off a debate that still goes on today. Ultimately, though, his presidency doesn't have a huge impact. There is a little bit better relationships with the Soviet Union, but for the most part, he was assassinated before he could do much about his policies.